The village of Little Harrow had been blanketed in a pristine layer of snow, the kind that made even the oldest cottages appear like gingerbread models, delicate and flawless. Icicles hung from the eaves like glass daggers, and the soft crunch of boots in the narrow lanes was the only sound disturbing the winter hush. For weeks, the villagers had eagerly awaited the annual winter garden party at Elmwood Manor, the grandest house in Little Harrow, perched at the top of a gentle hill with sweeping views of the countryside. Miss Jane Marple, though never one to seek attention, had accepted the invitation out of courtesy to her friend, Mrs. Penelope Faraday, whose enthusiasm for social gatherings was as boundless as the village snowdrifts. Bundled in a heavy wool coat and a knitted hat, Miss Marple arrived with her usual calm dignity, her eyes observing everything. Subtle gestures, odd glances, the faintest trace of a lie in a smile or hesitation in speech. The manor, a stately red brick building with ivy climbing its frosted walls, had been transformed for the occasion. Brightly colored bunting fluttered between the snow-laden trees in the garden, while lanterns glowed warmly, casting a golden light over the assembled guests. A string quartet played softly near the conservatory, where delicate pastries and steaming cups of tea were laid out on white linen tables. "Jane, you must try Mrs. Hargreaves's mince pies. They're exceptional this year," Mrs. Faraday exclaimed, pulling Miss Marple toward the buffet with a forceful but friendly energy. Miss Marple smiled politely, accepting a single pastry with her characteristic restraint. While others chatted animatedly, she allowed her gaze to wander over the partygoers, taking mental notes of the relationships and small frictions visible in the polite smiles and measured laughter. There was Mr. Thomas Linton, the local solicitor, who seemed to hover a little too close to the young Miss Eleanor Bridges, whispering in an undertone. Lady Winifred Ashcombe, with her sharp eyes and habitual frown, surveying the room as if evaluating property instead of people, and old Mr. Grimes, the retired baker, who shuffled about muttering to himself about the snow ruining the market deliveries. The first hours passed uneventfully, as most winter garden parties in Little Harrow did. There was laughter, polite conversation, and the occasional accidental spill of tea. Yet Miss Marple's sharp instincts told her that beneath this serene surface, tensions simmered, small grudges, petty rivalries and jealousies that might seem insignificant to outsiders, but, if manipulated, could lead to disaster. It was just as she was noting the subtle stiffness between Lady Ashcombe and the Faradays that the tranquility shattered. A piercing scream echoed from the far end of the garden, near the ornamental fountain, where a group of guests had been attempting an impromptu snowball game. Miss Marple, though startled, moved with calm efficiency, threading through clusters of shocked guests toward the source of the sound. There, sprawled against the icy marble rim of the fountain, lay Mr. Henry Calderwood, the local historian and, some said, the most pompous man in Little Harrow. His eyes were wide, a deep red stain spreading across the pristine white of his woolen scarf. Guests gathered around, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief, murmuring conjectures and accusations in a chaotic chorus. "Call for Dr. Whitcomb!" someone shouted, while another insisted it might only be a fainting spell. But Miss Marple, kneeling beside Mr. Calderwood and gently raising his hand to check his pulse, noted immediately that his breathing was shallow and uneven. "I fear," she murmured, almost to herself, "that this is no accident." The initial attempts to revive him failed. Panic rippled through the crowd. Mr. Thomas Linton attempted to push back the guests, asserting his authority with a clumsy urgency, while Lady Ashcombe's face betrayed her unease more plainly than her words could. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed quietly, noting the placement of footprints in the snow, the slightly disturbed ivy near the fountain, and the expressions of those gathered. Some were too still, others too eager to be helpful. All details mattered. "What happened?" Mrs. Faraday's voice trembled as she reached Miss Marple's side, clutching her gloves tightly. "I cannot say yet," Miss Marple replied calmly, though her mind raced. "But there are several things here that merit careful observation." She glanced up at the anxious faces around her. "And I suspect not all of them will be forthcoming with the truth." As the doctor arrived, confirming her fears, the party dissolved into whispers and fearful speculation. The snow continued to fall silently, as if indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath it. Miss Marple stepped back, her mind quietly cataloguing the events. A gathering meant for joy, now marred by sudden death, a man whose scholarly arrogance might have earned him enemies, and a group of villagers whose hidden grievances and rivalries would now come under intense scrutiny. Amidst the murmurs, one thing was already clear to her. The truth would not be found in the surface appearances or in the loudest voices, but in the small, overlooked gestures, the subtle inconsistencies, and the secrets carefully buried beneath the village's polite facades. And she intended to uncover every one of them, gently, quietly, yet with unerring accuracy. As the crowd was shepherded indoors, Miss Marple lingered for a moment in the falling snow. The footprints around the fountain seemed almost to whisper their story to her if one knew how to listen. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her mind already piecing together fragments that others considered trivial. Little Harrow's winter had grown deadly, and she was certain that the secrets it concealed were about to surface, one snowflake at a time. By the following morning, Little Harrow was alive with murmurs and conjecture. The snow, once pristine and enchanting, had become a stage for whispered accusations, rumor and conjecture carried on the cold, sharp wind that swept through the village lanes. Miss Marple, from her modest sitting room at Cherry Tree Cottage, observed the flurry of activity with quiet attention. Her keen eyes, softened by age yet unyielding in acuity, noticed small details that others dismissed entirely. The dark circles beneath the eyes of those who had stayed up to gossip, the unusual brightness of a scarf hiding a worried flush, and the forced cheer of shopkeepers attempting to reassure passing customers. The first to react publicly was Mrs. Penelope Faraday, whose invitations to tea and lunch had always been the lifeblood of Elmwood Manor's social calendar. Her letter to the local paper, meticulously worded, spoke of shock and sorrow, emphasizing the tragedy of losing Mr. Calderwood, a man esteemed for his scholarly contributions, though occasionally trying in manner. The letter, read aloud at the bakery and the grocer's, ignited a storm of conversation among the villagers. "Scholarly contributions," whispered Mrs. Beecham, the widow who lived opposite the church. "I dare say he was just an old windbag who prattled on about things no one understood." Her friend, Mrs. Higgs, tutted in agreement, adjusting her fur muff. "And yet they found him by the fountain in the snow. It can't have been an accident. No one falls on marble like that unless someone has pushed them." Indeed, suspicion was the first and most favored response. Every villager seemed to harbor a theory. Mr. Thomas Linton, attempting to maintain the appearance of composure while secretly anxious about his involvement in Calderwood's recent property dispute, suggested cautiously to anyone who would listen, "Perhaps it was a misstep. The fountain can be treacherous when frozen. Accidents do happen." But Lady Winifred Ashcombe, ever sharp and dismissive of half-truths, raised her voice over the murmurs, making a point to be heard. "Accident. Preposterous. Calderwood had enemies, and in this village, every minor quarrel is magnified. He irritated half the parish with his pedantry and conceit. Surely someone took advantage of the frost to settle a grievance." The children of the village, blissfully unaware of the full weight of the tragedy, speculated differently. Young Timothy Faraday, his face smudged with chocolate from the previous day's party treats, whispered to his sister, "I bet it was the snowman. I saw him wink at Mr. Calderwood." Eleanor, his older sister, giggled nervously. "Timothy, don't say such things. People are talking. Even the usually unremarkable shopkeepers contributed theories, each more fanciful than the last. At the general store, Mr. Grimes muttered that it's witches, mark my words, while the butcher, slicing ham for breakfast, suggested a secret family feud, although he had no knowledge of any such feud himself. The gossip, like wildfire, leapt from doorway to doorway, weaving a tapestry of imagined motives and shadowy culprits. Miss Marple, observing all from the window of Cherry Tree Cottage, sipped her morning tea and catalogued the behaviors with her usual patience. She noted Mr. Linton's forced geniality and the twitching of Lady Ashcombe's lips when anyone mentioned Calderwood's name. She observed how Mrs. Faraday busied herself with charity letters and social arrangements, perhaps as a way to distract from her own unease, and how Mr. Grimes, despite his talk of witches, lingered at the baker's counter long enough to catch scraps of every whispered theory. I should not be surprised if the entire village concocts a dozen theories before noon, Miss Marple said quietly to herself. And yet, only one will prove close to the truth. By mid-morning, the constable, Mr. Pritchard, had made the rounds, taking statements from those present at Elmwood Manor. His manner was earnest, though somewhat befuddled by the sheer number of conflicting accounts. Mrs. Beecham's testimony that she had seen Mr. Calderwood arguing with Mr. Linton over property deeds clashed with Mr. Higgs's recollection of Calderwood speaking quietly with Lady Ashcombe about the upcoming Historical Society meeting. Each statement, sincere in its own right, only served to deepen the web of confusion. Meanwhile, the vicar, Reverend Smythe, attempted to impose a moral framework upon the tragedy, insisting during his sermon that misfortune often reveals the hidden sins of the human heart. The snow, he proclaimed solemnly, may cover the ground, but it cannot hide the truth from those who seek it earnestly. Several villagers nodded, taking comfort in this thought, while others scowled, feeling the weight of implied guilt. Even the mundane routines of the village were tinged with the residue of shock. The postman delivered letters more slowly, his eyes darting anxiously toward every yard. The milkman left bottles on doorsteps with trembling hands, and the school teacher, Miss Peters, paused mid-lesson to whisper warnings about trust and deceit. In every conversation, the name of Calderwood was coupled with speculation, fear, or indignation. Yet, through it all, Miss Marple noted the subtle undercurrents. The polite, overly cheerful chatter at the bakery hid sharp glances and tightened jaws. The villagers' insistence that accidents happen masked a deeper anxiety, a worry that one of their own had deliberately disrupted the peace of the village. Miss Marple understood, as she always did, that ordinary events could conceal extraordinary truths, and that those who appeared innocent were often the most adept at concealing their motives. By late afternoon, the entire village seemed to orbit around the fountain incident. The snow, which had initially inspired wonder, now lay trampled, bearing the imprints of anxious boots and hurried footsteps. Miss Marple took a solitary walk past Elmwood Manor, observing the disturbed snow, the subtle displacement of twigs, and the faint marks that suggested someone had lingered in places they claimed not to have visited. Even in the absence of formal investigation, the village had collectively begun the work of analysis, each mind forming hypotheses, each theory bending toward the storyteller's imagination rather than hard evidence. And all the while, Miss Marple watched and listened, gathering fragments of truth in the quiet corners of conversation, the nervous laughter of acquaintances and the unguarded expressions of those who believed themselves unnoticed. By evening, a sense of uneasy anticipation hung over Little Harrow. The villagers retired to their homes, carrying whispers of suspicion and curiosity, yet none could fully articulate what had truly occurred. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, considered the day's events with gentle precision. She understood that in a small village, secrets did not remain hidden for long, and that every rumor, every contradiction, every half-truth was a step closer to uncovering the reality behind Mr. Calderwood's death. And she knew, with quiet certainty, that the real story, the story that mattered, was only just beginning to unfold. The morning after the incident, Little Harrow began to resemble a village on edge. Footsteps crunched sharply in the frozen streets, voices lowered into whispers, and behind every frosted window, eyes watched and speculated. Elmwood Manor, normally a hub of warmth and genteel laughter, now stood solemn, its grand windows revealing the careful movements of those preparing for a more formal investigation. The snow around the fountain remained undisturbed, cordoned off by a ribbon that fluttered feebly in the winter wind, a crude attempt at order imposed upon a disorderly scene. Miss Marple arrived promptly, carrying her customary notebook tucked inside her coat pocket. She did not hurry, for she had long learned that haste often blinded the observer. Instead, she walked with a measured pace, noting the nuances of behavior in the villages she passed. The local constable, Mr. Pritchard, was already at Elmwood, attempting, with limited success, to manage the flow of curious neighbors. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his coat collar nervously. "I hope you slept well after yesterday's unsettling events." "Good morning, Constable," she replied softly. "Sleep is adequate, thank you. And how fares the investigation?" "Well, we're collecting statements and trying to make sense of the accounts. But it's confusing. Everyone seems to remember something differently. And frankly, we're not sure if it was an accident or something more deliberate." Miss Marple's lips pressed together briefly. She stepped closer to the fountain, observing the subtle impressions in the snow. Footprints were scattered and overlapped, yet some bore a weight and directionality that suggested hesitation. Someone had lingered, perhaps reconsidering or waiting for another person. She noted a small patch of disturbed ivy near the fountain's base, torn slightly but not enough to indicate a struggle. "Interesting," she murmured to herself, jotting a few words in her notebook. Inside Elmwood Manor, the atmosphere was tense. Mrs. Penelope Faraday flitted about, ensuring that the servants served tea promptly and that visitors' questions were answered politely, yet she could not conceal the tremor in her hands. Miss Marple noted how the hostess's attention to detail masked anxiety rather than calm. Lady Winifred Ashcombe arrived shortly thereafter, her sharp eyes scanning the room, lingering longer than politeness required on each guest, silently judging their reactions. Mr. Thomas Linton, the solicitor, remained by the fireplace, ostensibly reading the morning paper, but Miss Marple saw the subtle tightness in his jaw and the rapid blinking that betrayed his nerves. Even in the presence of strangers, the veneer of composure cracked in small but telling ways. Miss Marple began her subtle questioning, never appearing intrusive. She asked Mrs. Faraday about the layout of the garden during yesterday's party. Was everyone grouped closely together, or were there some who preferred solitude? "Oh, there were small clusters," Mrs. Faraday replied, smoothing her gloves. "Some danced lightly near the conservatory. The children played near the fountain. But of course, everyone was enjoying themselves and no one expected." She stopped abruptly, eyes wide. "No one expected anything," Miss Marple said gently, allowing the thought to hang. "And yet, something did occur. It always does when human nature is involved." She turned to examine the fountain more closely, noting the pattern of snow disturbed in concentric rings. A careful observer might assume chaos, but Miss Marple knew better. Certain footprints indicated a pause at the fountain, a hesitation that suggested the person responsible had lingered long enough to observe, perhaps to ensure an outcome. The idea of observation rather than confrontation was crucial. Miss Marple spoke briefly to Mr. Grimes, the retired baker, who had insisted on recounting the events repeatedly. "Did anyone seem nervous yesterday, in your opinion?" she asked, in her mild, unassuming manner. "Well," Grimes said slowly, scratching his chin, "I did notice Mr. Linton speaking with Mr. Calderwood quite closely. I thought it was about property matters, but Well, Linton seemed a touch impatient, as if he wanted something resolved before the day ended. Miss Marple made a discreet note. Patience, or the lack thereof, was a subtle signal of intention. She also observed how the villagers positioned themselves during conversations. Those who were innocent often spoke with hesitation, while those with guilty inclinations sometimes overcompensated with eagerness or indignation. Her investigation then led her to a quiet corner where the children had been playing. Timothy Faraday and Eleanor, flushed from the cold, recounted their version of events, tinged with imagination and exaggeration. Miss Marple listened without correction, for she knew that children's observations, unfiltered by social expectation, often revealed truths adults overlooked. A stray remark from Eleanor about a shadow by the fountain caught her attention. Shadows, as she knew, could indicate timing and movement previously unnoticed. The maid, young Sarah Hensley, provided another subtle clue. She mentioned seeing Lady Ashcombe lingering near the fountain while most guests were engaged elsewhere. Though she claimed it was only to admire the snow, Miss Marple noted the direction of her gaze and the pause in her movement. Everything, in Miss Marple's understanding, was potentially significant. By late morning, Miss Marple had gathered fragments from multiple sources. The children's vivid but imprecise memories, the nervous glances of adults, and the patterns of footprints in the snow. Alone in her thoughts, she pieced together the first outlines of the day's events. One theme emerged with striking clarity. Those who appeared the least concerned had the most reason to be. The first impressions rarely reveal the whole truth, she murmured, sipping her tea in a quiet moment. It is the small, overlooked gestures, the incongruities in speech, the hesitations, the excesses of politeness. All these speak louder than accusations. Miss Marple resolved that she would need to revisit Elmwood Manor, observe the reactions of those implicated by coincidence or by design, and note inconsistencies in their stories. Human behavior, she knew, would yield the necessary insights more reliably than any formal examination. Even as the villagers carried on with tentative routines, shops opening, letters delivered, lessons taught, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, cataloguing subtle signs. The curl of a lip, a faltering handshake, a glance darting too quickly away. Little Harrow was a village that prided itself on appearances, yet beneath that surface, fractures were forming, and the truth of Mr. Calderwood's death was beginning to crystallize in the mind of its most unassuming observer. By afternoon, she paused to consider the day's findings, realizing that the solution would require patience. Nothing was to be taken at face value. The whispers of the village were a labyrinth, each story both a truth and a deception. Yet, as always, Miss Marple's quiet certainty persisted. The smallest detail, if interpreted correctly, would illuminate the path to understanding, and she intended to follow that path wherever it led. By the second day after the incident, little Harrow was in a state of uneasy speculation. The news of Mr. Calderwood's death had rippled through the village like a cold wind, touching every household, every shop, and every casual conversation. Miss Marple, of course, was already at Elmwood Manor, quietly observing the interactions of those who might offer insight into the case. The room, large and warm, contrasted sharply with the chill outside, but it was tense with restrained emotion. The first to draw attention, unsurprisingly, was Mr. Thomas Linton. The solicitor's natural composure seemed brittle under the scrutiny of the villagers and the constable alike. He had been seen speaking with Calderwood just before the incident, his presence at the fountain making him a convenient suspect. Mr. Linton, aware of the suspicions, conducted himself with an exaggerated calmness, offering polite condolences to everyone present. Yet, to Miss Marple's careful eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw and the restless tapping of his foot betrayed agitation. Lady Winifred Ashcombe, meanwhile, kept her distance, her posture rigid and her gaze sharp. She had reason to dislike Calderwood. His frequent critiques of her historical restorations were well known. During a brief exchange with the maid, Sarah Hensley, Lady Ashcombe's impatience had manifested in a curt tone and a glance that lingered just a moment too long, suggesting annoyance rather than grief. Miss Marple took note. Irritation, even subtle, could indicate motive, though it did not yet indicate culpability. Constable Pritchard had begun compiling witness statements, and the villagers were eager to contribute. Each testimony added layers of complexity to the narrative. Mrs. Beecham insisted she had seen Mr. Linton argue heatedly with Calderwood over property rights. Mrs. Higgs claimed she had heard Lady Ashcombe make an indignant remark about Calderwood's interference in parish matters. Mr. Grimes, the retired baker, offered that Calderwood had been a difficult man who made enemies without effort, suggesting that anyone could be implicated. Miss Marple listened to every account with patience, her mind forming a delicate web of relationships, grudges, and inconsistencies. She recognized the pattern she had often observed in her experience with human behavior. The obvious suspect, while convenient, was rarely the true culprit. The first impressions were often designed to mislead, intentionally or otherwise, and she suspected that the village's natural eagerness for closure might cloud their judgment. The local vicar, Reverend Smythe, offered his own interpretation to a small gathering in the drawing room. "We must consider all possibilities," he said solemnly, "but one cannot ignore the fact that the fountain incident coincides with recent disputes. Providence sometimes allows us to witness the consequences of discord." His words, well meant, had the unintended effect of amplifying suspicion, leaving villagers glancing at each other with new wariness. Miss Marple observed Lady Ashcombe more closely as she conversed with Mrs. Faraday. The conversation was polite, almost cordial, yet Lady Ashcombe's eyes occasionally flicked toward Mr. Linton, as if assessing the threat he might pose, or perhaps the threat he imagined in her. The careful balance of deception and social courtesy fascinated Miss Marple. It revealed more than mere words could express. Mr. Linton, now clearly aware of the growing scrutiny, approached the vicar and began speaking in a low, controlled voice. His account was precise, each sentence deliberate, almost rehearsed. Miss Marple noted the subtle signs of strain, the slight hitch in his breath, the micro-adjustment of his cuff, the way his eyes occasionally darted toward the fountain as if seeking reassurance. These were the telltale indicators of a mind under pressure, though not necessarily of guilt. Meanwhile, Mrs. Faraday was attempting to mediate, her voice warm but urgent. Now, everyone," she said, smoothing the folds of her skirt, "we must not jump to conclusions. We all admired Mr. Calderwood, and to suggest that one of our own caused this would be dreadful." Her insistence on propriety, while admirable, drew Miss Marple's attention. Anxiety often masqueraded as over-polite concern. It could reveal more than open grief. Miss Marple excused herself for a brief walk in the garden, allowing the guests to continue their speculations without feeling observed. The snow, still crisp and white, bore footprints that intersected in unusual ways. She noticed a shallow indentation beside the fountain, as if someone had crouched or lingered there. A scarf, partially buried in snow, suggested that someone might have paused, adjusted clothing, or perhaps staged the scene. Every minor detail, Miss Marple knew, contributed to a greater understanding of the event. Returning indoors, she engaged in casual conversation with the children. Eleanor Bridges, bright-eyed and unguarded, repeated her account of seeing a shadow by the fountain, while Timothy Faraday insisted that he had seen someone run away from the area. Though their recollections were tinged with innocence and exaggeration, Miss Marple interpreted them carefully. Children often noticed things adults overlooked, and their unfiltered observations could reveal timing, movement, or intent hidden from more practiced eyes. By mid-afternoon, Constable Pritchard had decided to focus on Mr. Linton, whose presence at the fountain and known disputes with Calderwood made him the most convenient candidate. Villagers whispered in corners, speculating that the solicitor's professional frustrations had escalated into violence. Lady Ashcombe, despite her evident disdain for Calderwood, remained under suspicion as well. Others were mentioned in passing, though Miss Marple noted that these accusations were less substantive, often arising from petty grievances or hearsay. Miss Marple, for her part, remained unobtrusive. She did not confront the suspects, nor did she suggest conclusions. Instead, she observed behavior, the flick of an eyelid, the tightening of a hand, the involuntary step back when a topic was raised. These small gestures, often invisible to casual observers, were far more revealing than overt statements or outward composure. As evening approached, the manor grew quieter. Guests departed, leaving behind an air of tense expectancy. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her notebook open but rarely written upon. Instead, she reviewed the impressions, subtle interactions, and fragmented accounts she had gathered throughout the day. Patterns were beginning to emerge, but she knew that the true resolution required patience. The obvious suspects, Mr. Linton and Lady Ashcombe, were merely pieces in a more intricate puzzle. The first suspects, she murmured to herself, rarely reveal the whole truth, but they are invaluable in uncovering it. Her eyes drifted toward the snow-covered fountain visible through the window. There, she thought, lay the scene in miniature, a stage upon which human motives and miscalculations had played out. And while the village rushed to judgment, Miss Marple's calm attention ensured that no detail, however small or seemingly insignificant, would escape notice. The investigation had begun in earnest, but the true story, the tangled web of grudges, secrets, and deception, was only just starting to reveal itself. And Miss Marple, as always, would unravel it with patience, observation, and the gentle persistence that had long distinguished her among the unassuming villagers of Little Harrow. The morning sun glinted weakly through the frost-coated windows of Elmwood Manor, illuminating the remnants of yesterday's turmoil. Guests had departed, the formalities of condolence largely concluded, yet an air of tension lingered, almost tangible in its weight. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace with a small notebook in hand, observed with quiet intensity as the household settled into an uneasy routine. The servants moved efficiently, but their eyes flickered nervously toward the doorways, and the occasional hushed whisper betrayed the anxiety that even decorum could not mask. Miss Marple's attention, however, was fixed on a detail so small that most would have overlooked it entirely: the arrangement of items on the table beside the fireplace. Yesterday, in the commotion surrounding Mr. Calderwood's collapse, a small decorative vase had been knocked over. It had been set back into place by the maid, yet something about its positioning caught Miss Marple's eye. The vase was slightly off-center, its alignment inconsistent with the other carefully arranged objects. On instinct, she noted it as a possible clue, though its significance was not immediately apparent. Curiosity compelled her to ask a few discreet questions. "Sarah," she said gently, addressing the young maid, "yesterday, before the unfortunate incident, did anything unusual occur near this table or in this room?" Sarah's eyes widened and she shook her head vigorously. "No, ma'am, nothing out of the ordinary. I was busy serving tea and clearing trays. I only noticed Mr. Calderwood speaking with Mr. Linton near the fountain, and then everything happened so quickly." Miss Marple nodded, concealing the slight arch of her brow. She could sense the maid's honesty. The girl was too frightened to fabricate details, yet she had not noticed the significance of small movements. It was precisely these minor, often disregarded occurrences that frequently held the key to understanding. Later, as she strolled through the garden, Miss Marple revisited the fountain, her eyes scanning the snow-strewn ground with meticulous care. There, among the footprints and the faintly disturbed patches of snow, she discovered an indentation almost invisible to the casual observer. It was small, circular, and shallow, as though an object had rested there for a brief moment. She crouched, brushing the snow aside, and noted that it was slightly warmer than the surrounding snow, suggesting recent placement. A soft cough alerted her to the presence of Mrs. Penelope Faraday, who approached with an anxious expression. "Jane, do you believe we will ever understand what happened? The police, they seem to think it's an accident, yet the village will not accept that explanation." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Patience, Penelope. The truth is often revealed in fragments, and some are easier to overlook than others. Even an accident, if observed carefully, leaves traces." She did not elaborate, knowing that speculation at this stage could obscure rather than clarify. Returning indoors, she examined Mr. Calderwood's study, a room filled with books and papers meticulously organized, yet with the faintest signs of disruption. A letter, partially open on the desk, bore a faint smudge of ink, not enough to be immediately noticeable, but sufficient to suggest hurried handling. A careful observer might infer that the letter had been read, perhaps intercepted, by someone seeking information without Mr. Calderwood's knowledge. Miss Marple made a note, knowing that the significance of such a minor detail often became apparent only in conjunction with other, seemingly trivial signs. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple observed the interactions of those present at Elmwood Manor with increasing scrutiny. Lady Ashcombe, visiting again under the pretext of condolence, exhibited a series of subtle, contradictory gestures. She smoothed her gloves repeatedly, glanced frequently toward the fireplace, and avoided direct eye contact when discussing the fountain. To most, these behaviors would appear as mere nervousness, but Miss Marple perceived them as a deliberate concealment of something. Even the children contributed unwittingly. Timothy Faraday, tugging at his sister Eleanor's sleeve, whispered about a glint of metal he had noticed near the fountain. Eleanor, however, had dismissed it at the time, focusing instead on the dramatic fall. Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet interest. Children's observations, unfiltered by adult assumptions, often revealed crucial truths overlooked by those in positions of responsibility. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, sitting silently while the staff attended to routine tasks. Her gaze fell again upon the decorative vase. Something about it, the slight tilt, the position relative to the fireplace, resonated with the impressions she had gathered in the garden. The small indentation in the snow, the smudged letter, Lady Ashcombe's subtle evasions, and the children's remarks coalesced into a pattern, though the full meaning remained elusive. She reflected on the human elements of the case. The obvious suspects, Mr. Linton, Lady Ashcombe, had motives rooted in property disputes and social pride, yet motives alone did not explain the physical traces left behind. Someone had moved deliberately, carefully, leaving behind hints that only a patient observer could interpret. And Miss Marple, with her long experience of human nature, was acutely aware that the least expected person often orchestrated the most calculated actions. At tea, she engaged Mrs. Faraday in casual conversation. "Did anyone linger near the fountain before Mr. Calderwood approached?" she asked lightly, as though speaking of nothing of importance. Mrs. Faraday shook her head. "I don't recall anyone particularly lingering, though it all happened so fast." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The rush, the panic, the confusion, it all served to conceal the subtle manipulations of someone who had intended to control the scene. She knew that the hidden clue was not in what people said, but in what they overlooked. The tiny shifts, the displaced objects, the glances and gestures that betrayed awareness beyond casual attention. Later, she revisited the fountain under the fading light, examining the indentation with meticulous care. The circular mark suggested something small, portable, and deliberately placed. A leaf, a stone, or a decorative object might have been used, left, or dropped there. Something that could easily escape notice, yet indicated intention. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting these fragments to the known behaviors, grudges, and observations she had accumulated. By evening, she concluded that the key to understanding the incident lay not in the dramatic gestures or vocal accusations, but in the small, nearly invisible actions that hinted at deliberate placement and observation. The minor, overlooked detail, the indentation in the snow, the vase slightly askew, the smudged letter, was a whisper of the truth that others would dismiss. Yet Miss Marple recognized it for what it was, a thread that, when followed, could unravel the tangled web of deceit surrounding Mr. Calderwood's death. And so, in the quiet of Elmwood Manor, with the fire casting long shadows across the room, Miss Marple prepared to pursue that thread, knowing that even the smallest clue could illuminate the path to a revelation the village was not yet ready to confront. By the third day, Little Harrow seemed transformed. The snow, once a symbol of serene beauty, now mirrored the cold unease permeating the village. Elmwood Manor, still the center of curiosity, became a stage for confrontation. Villagers arrived under the pretext of offering condolences, but the true aim of many was far less innocent, to uncover what others might be hiding and, in the process, reveal themselves. Miss Marple entered the drawing-room mid-morning, her keen eyes immediately noting the subtle undercurrents of tension. Mr. Thomas Linton, seated stiffly near the fireplace, maintained a carefully neutral expression, yet the rigid set of his shoulders betrayed unease. Lady Ashcombe, standing near the window, observed the room with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, her sharp gaze flicking from one person to the next. Even the usually quiet servants moved with an unnatural swiftness, aware of the heightened atmosphere. Mrs. Penelope Faraday, ever the hostess, attempted to preserve decorum. "Please, everyone," she said, her voice tinged with forced cheer, "let us remember the purpose of our visits. Mr. Calderwood's death is a tragedy, and speculation does no honor to his memory." Miss Marple, however, understood that Mrs. Faraday's insistence on propriety was as much an attempt to conceal her own anxieties as it was to enforce social order. It was in these carefully managed interactions that the first genuine confrontations of the day would arise. Mr. Linton, unable to restrain his own apprehension, initiated a discussion about Calderwood's recent property dealings. "It is essential," he said with measured formality, "that we review the facts concerning the Elmwood estate. Misunderstandings may have arisen that contributed to yesterday's unfortunate incident." Lady Ashcombe's lips tightened. "Facts, Mr. Linton? Or convenient interpretations suited to your position as solicitor? Calderwood's involvement with the Historical Society was no secret, yet your interference with his collections was noted by several members." Her gaze was sharp, accusatory, and Miss Marple observed the subtle tension it provoked in the others present. Mrs. Faraday attempted to mediate, smoothing the air with gentle words. "Surely, this is not the moment for disputes of that nature. We must focus on the tragedy itself, rather than assign blame prematurely." Yet, despite her efforts, old grievances began to surface. Mr. Grimes, the retired baker, muttered, "It's well known Calderwood liked to poke his nose into everyone's business. Perhaps he went too far, and someone finally reacted." His tone was casual, but the implication was clear, and the room shifted slightly, each individual assessing how such a remark might implicate them, or someone they knew. Miss Marple quietly observed these interactions, noting how the villagers' responses varied. Mr. Linton's composure, though externally polite, revealed subtle cracks. The brief lift of his eyebrows, a finger drumming lightly against the armrest, and a faint, restless tapping of his foot. Lady Ashcombe's disdain manifested not in words, but in a series of controlled gestures, smoothing gloves, shifting her weight, and a tight line of her lips. Even Mrs. Faraday's gentle mediation hinted at unease, as though she feared revelations might touch her indirectly. The first confrontation of substance occurred when Eleanor Bridges, with the frankness only a child possesses, mentioned seeing Lady Ashcombe near the fountain before the incident. Her voice, innocent yet pointed, drew immediate attention. Lady Ashcombe's eyes flickered, a subtle moment of surprise quickly masked by composure. "I merely admired the snow," she said smoothly, though her gaze momentarily avoided Miss Marple's. Miss Marple, ever patient, noted the inconsistency. Admiring the snow was plausible, yet the precise timing and positioning suggested something more. It was in these small contradictions, easily dismissed by others, that the truth often hid. Soon after, Mr. Linton found himself drawn into a delicate exchange with the vicar, Reverend Smythe. The discussion centered on morality and responsibility, veiled in courteous language, yet loaded with subtext. The solicitor's defense of his actions regarding Calderwood's estate was careful, measured, but occasionally faltered under subtle questioning about his movements the previous day. Miss Marple observed the micro-expressions, a tightening of the jaw, a quick glance to the window, and an almost imperceptible shift in posture. Signals that, while minor, were deeply revealing to someone trained in human observation. Meanwhile, the servants continued their work, yet snippets of overheard conversation provided further insight. Sarah Hensley, the maid, mentioned that she had seen a shadow near the fountain, an observation that seemed minor but, to Miss Marple, hinted at timing and intention. The subtle placement of footprints and the disturbed snow corroborated the child's words, suggesting that the scene had been manipulated to some extent, or at least observed with deliberate attention. As the day progressed, Miss Marple began to piece together the patterns emerging from these confrontations. The obvious suspects, Mr. Linton and Lady Ashcombe, had clear motives rooted in property disputes and social pride. Yet the subtle interactions, inconsistencies in recollections, and overlooked observations suggested additional complexity. Someone had moved carefully through the events, ensuring that attention was deflected elsewhere, while minor, nearly invisible details bore silent witness to their actions. The villagers themselves unwittingly revealed more than they intended. Mrs. Beecham, despite her outward indignation, betrayed a hint of relief whenever Mr. Linton or Lady Ashcombe was questioned, suggesting her own knowledge of minor grievances or secrets within the community. Mr. Grimes' casual remarks, though seemingly offhand, illuminated old resentments and rivalries, adding layers to motives previously unconsidered. Miss Marple noted another curious detail: the positions of objects in the manor, especially those near the fountain and the fireplace. Small displacements, a vase tilted, a book slightly askew, hinted at subtle movements that had escaped the notice of both the constable and the villagers. These minute adjustments, when interpreted together, suggested deliberate orchestration rather than random accident. By late afternoon, tensions had reached a quiet climax. The initial confrontations had revealed fractures, hidden resentments, and overlapping motives. Guests, servants, and even children contributed observations that, when considered collectively, formed a pattern. Miss Marple, however, refrained from overt speculation. She allowed the villagers' words and actions to accumulate, trusting that the seemingly insignificant fragments would ultimately illuminate the true narrative. Before departing, she lingered near the drawing-room window, observing Lady Ashcombe and Mr. Linton, both lost in thought. The snow, soft and unbroken beyond the garden, mirrored the calm surface that masked the turbulence beneath. Miss Marple understood that beneath the polite facades, every villager carried secrets, some trivial, others dangerous, and that understanding these hidden truths would be essential to uncovering the circumstances surrounding Mr. Calderwood's death. People, she murmured to herself, reveal themselves more clearly in the cracks than in the glare of daylight, and it is there I must look. Thus the stage was set. The first confrontations had exposed the surface tensions, but the deeper, more insidious secrets remained carefully hidden. Miss Marple, with her characteristic patience and acute perception, prepared to trace these secrets, knowing that the resolution of the case depended not on public declarations or dramatic confessions, but on the quiet unraveling of the concealed motives that had shaped the day's tragic events. The day after the confrontations, little Harrow awoke to a fresh layer of snow, crisp and unbroken, masking the chaos that simmered beneath the village's calm exterior. Elmwood Manor, still at the heart of speculation, became the site of an unexpected development that would complicate the investigation far beyond previous assumptions. Miss Marple arrived mid-morning, her eyes immediately drawn to the subtle disarray in the foyer. The previous evening, the vicar and several villagers had visited, discussing the possible motives and timelines with animated concern. Now, a new element had been introduced. A parcel, unclaimed and conspicuously placed near the front door, addressed in a careful, precise hand to Mr. Calderwood. Its contents remained unknown, yet the envelope's presence suggested that the deceased had been engaged in correspondence that might bear upon the incident at the fountain. "Miss Marple," called Mrs. Faraday, emerging from the drawing-room, "we found this on the doorstep this morning. It had been carefully set aside, but it is addressed to Henry. Do you think it could have any bearing on what happened?" Miss Marple took the parcel, noting the meticulous handwriting and faint scent of lavender, a detail that suggested deliberate choice rather than chance. She set it aside for examination later. "Possibly," she said softly, "though we must consider all details, even those that seem innocuous. Sometimes the smallest item carries the heaviest weight of meaning." The first visitor of consequence that day was Mr. Edwin Carraway, a solicitor from a neighboring village who had arrived unexpectedly. He claimed acquaintance with Calderwood through professional correspondence, yet his presence immediately introduced a new complication. He carried a briefcase, its worn leather hinting at frequent use, and a manner of understated authority that commanded attention without seeming ostentatious. "I understand there has been a tragic incident," Mr. Carraway said, speaking first to Mrs. Faraday and then to Miss Marple. "I was in the neighborhood on business and felt it prudent to call. Mr. Calderwood had shared certain confidential documents with me concerning Elmwood Manor and other estates in the vicinity. I feared they might now be at risk." Miss Marple observed the man carefully. His statements were precise, yet there was a flicker in his expression, a microsecond hesitation that suggested awareness of more than he admitted. The interplay of truth and omission was familiar territory for her. In her experience, those who seek to conceal frequently betray themselves in the smallest gestures. As the morning progressed, another twist revealed itself. Sarah Hensley, the young maid, approached Miss Marple with a quivering expression. "Ma'am," she whispered, "I found something in the library. A diary. It belonged to Mr. Calderwood. I didn't read it, of course, but it seemed important." Miss Marple's eyes brightened imperceptibly. A diary was a treasure trove of unfiltered thought, often more revealing than statements made to others. She took the small leather-bound volume, noting the faint indentation of a bookmark and the way the pages were slightly worn at the corners. These subtle signs suggested frequent use, particularly in the days preceding the fatal incident. Careful examination revealed an entry that seemed ordinary at first glance, but carried subtle implications. Calderwood had written of concerns regarding the conduct of certain villagers, mentions of disputes over property, and observations about seemingly innocuous conversations that now, in retrospect, hinted at deeper tensions. Miss Marple noted that the diary corroborated several minor, previously overlooked clues: the shifted vase, the indentation in the snow, and the fleeting expressions of anxiety among those present. By midday, the village's attention had shifted to another, more public twist. A letter had arrived at the post office, unsigned but detailing a claim to part of the Elmwood estate. The language was formal, yet insistent, implying entitlement and knowledge of Calderwood's recent plans. The villagers speculated eagerly. Could this have been a motive for foul play? The arrival of external parties, claiming rights or information, introduced new pressure, destabilizing the earlier assumption that the crime had arisen solely from internal grievances. Miss Marple, seated quietly with the diary in hand, synthesized the new information. The interactions between Linton, Lady Ashcombe, and the recently arrived Mr. Carroway, combined with the content of Calderwood's diary, suggested a web of overlapping motives. Each person, while possessing legitimate grievances or interests, also acted within the constraints of village society, carefully masking true intentions beneath layers of politeness and etiquette. Later, the vicar received a telegram, an anonymous note hinting at irregularities in Calderwood's historical bequests to the parish. The telegram was brief but precise, implying that certain bequests were in dispute, and that knowledge of these disputes might have influenced events at the manor. Villagers, naturally, assumed this was evidence of conspiracy, while Miss Marple, ever patient, considered the implications. Someone wished to misdirect suspicion, to draw attention toward financial and legal matters, while the true cause remained subtle and human in nature. In the afternoon, the diary revealed yet another complication. Calderwood had recorded observations about a minor disagreement with the housekeeper over the placement of objects near the fountain. Details that seemed trivial but, in the context of the incident, suggested he had been aware of subtle manipulations. The tiny adjustments to the vase and books, the careful positioning of snow on the steps, even the placement of certain personal effects, all formed a pattern that hinted at intention rather than accident. Miss Marple, reflecting on these developments, understood that the villagers' rush to identify the obvious suspect obscured more than it revealed. Mr. Linton's visible agitation, Lady Ashcombe's controlled gestures, and the arrival of Mr. Carroway were all important, yet incomplete pieces. The hidden thread connecting them, the subtle orchestration of events, remained largely invisible, known only to the individual who had anticipated human reactions with the precision of a master manipulator. As twilight fell, the manor grew quiet. The villagers had departed, some emboldened by speculation, others subdued by the weight of accumulating mystery. Miss Marple lingered, reading through the diary with methodical care, noting patterns, contradictions, and small indicators of deliberate action. The fresh layer of snow outside remained untouched, a silent witness to the hidden machinations she was beginning to untangle. The most revealing actions, she murmured to herself, are rarely those performed in public view. They occur in hesitation, in the subtle placement of objects, in gestures unnoticed. The visible chaos is merely a mask for the quiet intentions beneath. By the close of the day, it was clear that little Harrow faced more than a simple tragedy. A cascade of revelations, the diary, the anonymous telegram, the arrival of Mr. Carroway, and the continued minor inconsistencies in behavior, had complicated the narrative, ensuring that the investigation would require careful interpretation of both human behavior and overlooked detail. Miss Marple, serene yet alert, resolved to continue her quiet scrutiny. She understood that the village, in its eagerness for resolution, would likely grasp at convenient explanations. But she, in her patient observation, would follow the subtle threads that others missed. Somewhere amid these newly revealed twists lay the answer to the puzzle of Elmwood Manor, a truth disguised beneath layers as of social propriety, hidden motives, and meticulous manipulation. The evening settled over Little Harrow with an unusual stillness. Elmwood Manor, normally a hub of polite chatter and restrained activity, now seemed almost suspended in anticipation, as though the very walls held their breath. Miss Marple, seated near the fire in the drawing-room, observed the room and its occupants with her characteristic patience. Every movement, glance, and sigh carried significance, though to the casual observer, the scene appeared perfectly ordinary. The first to arrive was Lady Winifred Ashcombe, summoned under the pretense of discussing minor matters related to the Historical Society. Her composure was immaculate, but Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in her hand and the slight narrowing of her eyes as she entered. It was precisely this kind of controlled anxiety that often betrayed unspoken truths. "Good evening, Lady Ashcombe," Miss Marple greeted softly. "I hope you do not mind my calling you here. I wished to review some of Mr. Calderwood's notes and thought your insight might be helpful." Lady Ashcombe inclined her head, replying with measured courtesy. "Certainly, Miss Marple. I am glad to assist in any way I can." Yet her eyes flicked quickly toward the fireplace, toward the corner where a small, slightly displaced vase rested. A small detail, unnoticed by most, yet to Miss Marple it was a key marker, an anchor around which she could subtly gauge reactions. Soon after, Mr. Thomas Linton arrived, ostensibly to discuss legal matters concerning the estate. He greeted Lady Ashcombe with polite detachment, though his gaze lingered longer than propriety required. Miss Marple observed him carefully, noting micro-expressions, a tightening of the jaw, a brief flush to the cheeks, and the subtle drumming of fingertips against his briefcase. Each sign, she knew, was a clue to unguarded emotions, often more revealing than words. Miss Marple began with casual conversation, speaking of minor village events and Mr. Calderwood's hobbies, deliberately avoiding mention of the fountain or the incident itself. Both suspects responded naturally, yet she detected shifts in posture, fleeting expressions, and small inconsistencies in their speech patterns, tiny deviations that spoke volumes to her practiced eye. After a few minutes, she introduced the first subtle test. Reaching for the diary, she mentioned, as if casually, that certain entries suggested Mr. Calderwood had been aware of movements near the fountain that seemed trivial but might have been deliberate. She did not accuse, only implied. Lady Ashcombe's fingers tightened around the edge of her notebook, a small but telling gesture. Mr. Linton's eyes flicked toward the vase near the fireplace, and he inhaled slightly, a subtle but perceptible sign of anxiety. Miss Marple noted the precision of their responses. One avoided direct eye contact, the other subtly altered posture. Each reaction, carefully observed, was a fragment of truth waiting to be pieced together. Next, she raised the topic of the parcel that had arrived the previous morning. Speaking lightly, she wondered aloud who might have been involved in sending messages to Mr. Calderwood, mentioning only that the envelope had been carefully prepared and smelled faintly of lavender. She watched the responses as though she were observing a tableau of human behavior. Lady Ashcombe's lips pressed briefly together, her gaze dropping to the floor. Mr. Linton, in contrast, leaned slightly forward, a subtle attempt to appear engaged yet measured, his expression betraying a fleeting tension before he masked it. Miss Marple noted these reactions meticulously. Each small movement, each brief hesitation, suggested awareness beyond mere social courtesy. When she mentioned the anonymous telegram received by the vicar, she framed it as curiosity rather than accusation. "A puzzling note, is it not?" she said softly. "Anonymous, yet precise. Such communications often reveal much more about human nature than the words themselves." Mr. Linton's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his pocket, a reaction to the suggestion of external scrutiny. Lady Ashcombe, meanwhile, shifted her weight, avoiding direct eye contact. Miss Marple knew these subtle responses were more informative than any overt confession could be. She allowed a moment of silence, giving both the opportunity to display micro-expressions, gestures, or phrases that might betray concealed intentions. She then brought attention to the indentation in the snow near the fountain, speaking of it not as evidence but as a mere curiosity. "Such things are often overlooked," she said quietly. Yet they can reveal intentions, timing, even the sequence of events if one observes carefully. Both Lady Ashcombe and Mr. Linton reacted differently. Lady Ashcombe's gaze flicked sharply to the window, as if visualizing a scene she preferred to deny. Mr. Linton's fingers drummed lightly on his briefcase once more, and his lips tightened in a micro-expression of suppressed irritation. Miss Marple recorded each subtle reaction in her mind, not rushing, allowing the psychological game to unfold organically. Finally, she posed a deliberately indirect question. If one were to interpret human behavior without preconceptions, what might the footprints in the snow, the subtle displacements, or the faint smudges on documents suggest? Both suspects paused, carefully measuring their responses. Lady Ashcombe smiled faintly, a polite mask, yet her eyes betrayed fleeting concern. Mr. Linton, attempting calm, gestured toward the diary and the parcel, but his voice faltered briefly, a subtle crack in the facade of composure. Miss Marple observed silently, noting the precise moments when internal tension escaped the veneer of civility. By the close of the evening, Miss Marple had gathered far more than words alone could have revealed. Through a series of subtle cues, indirect questions, and psychological nudges, she had observed which gestures were natural and which were carefully controlled. The hidden truth, she sensed, lay not in the accusations, but in the patterns of avoidance, the fleeting expressions of guilt, and the nuanced interplay of observation and concealment. As the visitors departed, Miss Marple remained by the window, looking out over the snow-covered gardens. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. She considered the day's careful observations, the minute reactions that had passed unnoticed by everyone else. The village's gossip, the legal disputes, and the social proprieties had all served as a background, a stage on which the true narrative had been silently enacted. The answers, she murmured to herself, are seldom in the loud declarations or overt gestures. They lie in the subtleties, the half-hidden movements, the pauses and hesitations. Those are the moments that reveal the mind behind the mask. Miss Marple, serene yet intensely alert, prepared to follow the final threads the following day. She knew the stage was set for revelation, that each subtle reaction, each overlooked detail, would soon converge into clarity. And as she gazed at the undisturbed snow, she recognized that patience, observation, and the quiet art of subtle testing had brought her closer to uncovering the truth than any overt investigation ever could. The following morning, Elmwood Manor was quiet, save for the soft patter of snow against the windows. Miss Marple had summoned the key figures under the pretext of a final discussion regarding Mr. Calderwood's estate. The drawing-room, usually cheerful with afternoon light and polished furniture, seemed charged with expectation. Each visitor arrived cautiously, aware that Miss Marple's invitation carried weight, though unaware of what was to come. First to enter was Lady Winifred Ashcombe, her posture carefully composed, her gaze steady yet guarded. She had the air of someone accustomed to maintaining control in tense situations, yet Miss Marple detected a faint tremor in her hands, a residual tension from the previous evening's subtle psychological tests. Mr. Thomas Linton arrived shortly after, equally cautious, though his movements betrayed a quieter anxiety. Both were seated at a polite distance, the fireplace crackling between them as if marking the stage for revelation. Miss Marple stood near the mantel, her hands folded calmly. She allowed a pause, letting the silence settle before beginning. "I have been reflecting upon the events surrounding Mr. Calderwood's death. It is curious, is it not, how human nature often seeks the simplest explanation, the most obvious culprit, when the truth is usually far more subtle." Her eyes rested on each of them in turn, unassuming yet piercing. "There are three critical elements that many have overlooked," she continued, opening her notebook. "The first is the series of footprints and the indentation near the fountain. At a glance, these may appear random, yet they are remarkably precise. Someone lingered, observed, and ensured that actions unfolded exactly as intended. She paused, letting her words sink in. Both Lady Ashcombe and Mr. Linton shifted slightly, though Miss Marple remained silent, letting the moment of tension speak. "The second element," she said, "is the seemingly trivial adjustments of objects in the manner. The vase slightly askew, the books misaligned, the smudged letter on Mr. Calderwood's desk. To most, these would appear insignificant, yet they reveal deliberate manipulation, the careful orchestration of a scene." Miss Marple's gaze flicked briefly toward Lady Ashcombe, who held her posture impeccably but could not disguise the brief narrowing of her eyes. "The third and most revealing element," Miss Marple continued, "is the human behavior itself, the half-hidden glances, the micro-expressions of tension, the gestures intended to mislead. While many of you possess clear motives, financial, social, or personal, the true culprit relied not on confrontation, but on subtle influence, knowing that the obvious suspects would be scrutinized while the real actions occurred unnoticed." A faint murmur passed through the room, though Miss Marple's calm tone prevented outright panic. She walked slowly toward the window, gesturing to the snow outside. "Observe the snow," she said lightly. "Pristine in most places, yet marked where attention has lingered. It mirrors the patterns of human observation, quiet, deliberate, unnoticed by the casual eye." Turning back, she addressed the group directly. "The person responsible for Mr. Calderwood's death is neither the solicitor nor the Lady Ashcombe, though each had opportunity and minor grievances. The true orchestrator is someone whose presence, demeanor, and subtle influence allowed them to manipulate events with precision. That person is, in fact—" Miss Marple paused, letting the room lean toward her, as though anticipating the words themselves would make the revelation tangible. Her eyes settled on Mrs. Penelope Faraday, who had remained quietly attentive, her hands folded, her expression carefully neutral. A slight flush rose to her cheeks, almost imperceptible, and Miss Marple noted it calmly. "You, Mrs. Faraday," Miss Marple said softly. "You orchestrated the events around the fountain, subtly influencing the timing and positioning of the key participants. Your motives were not malicious in the sense of hatred or revenge, but stemmed from a desire to control, to manage outcomes, and, admittedly, to protect secrets that Calderwood threatened to reveal." The room froze. Lady Ashcombe's eyes widened, and Mr. Linton's mouth opened, then closed again in surprise. Mrs. Faraday blinked, momentarily speechless, before regaining a composed tone. I don't understand," she murmured. "I loved Henry Calderwood. I would never—" Her voice faltered, betraying the tension she had carefully concealed. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Indeed, you did not wish him harm, but the careful positioning of objects, the subtle hints and distractions, and the precise timing allowed an accidental death to occur, a fall at the fountain precipitated by small manipulations. Your intention was never murder, but the results were tragically effective." She explained each piece of evidence meticulously. The indentation in the snow had been made by a small stool Mrs. Faraday had moved to encourage Calderwood's position near the fountain. The vase, slightly askew, was part of a deliberate arrangement to influence movement within the room. The smudged letter, previously overlooked, indicated that she had intercepted a note intended for Calderwood, redirecting the timing of certain encounters. Even the parcel and the diary, though apparently coincidental, had been influenced by her choices in arranging the household and guiding the sequence of events. Miss Marple continued, weaving together observations of behavior with the minor, nearly invisible manipulations that had occurred over the days preceding Calderwood's death. She highlighted the psychological subtleties, the glances, hesitations, and controlled gestures that revealed Mrs. Faraday's careful orchestration, even as she maintained an appearance of innocence. "Your influence," Miss Marple said quietly, was so subtle that those most likely to be accused, Mr. Linton and Lady Ashcombe, were merely actors within the framework you created. Each reacted predictably to your arrangements, and the snow, the objects, the minor disruptions, all bear witness to the hand that guided the scene. Mrs. Faraday's eyes filled with tears, though she maintained a calm voice. I never intended. I only wanted to prevent conflict, to control what I feared might harm the manor and those I care for. Miss Marple smiled gently. And that is precisely why human nature is so fascinating, Mrs. Faraday. Intentions, however well-meaning, can create outcomes unforeseen and sometimes tragic. The key lies in subtle observation, noticing the details overlooked, and understanding motives that are hidden beneath layers of propriety and kindness. The solicitor and Lady Ashcombe exchanged glances, relief and astonishment mingling in their expressions. Both had been implicated by superficial evidence, yet the truth was far more nuanced, revealing the intricate balance of human psychology, intention, and circumstance. Miss Marple concluded with characteristic calm. We cannot judge harshly for intent misaligned with outcome. What is essential is understanding the mechanisms of human behavior, the way minor actions, often unnoticed, can create consequences of great significance. In this, as always, the truth is both subtle and revealing. The revelation left the manor in a contemplative silence. Each participant reflected on the delicate web of actions, intentions, and observations that had led to Mr. Calderwood's untimely death. Miss Marple, ever composed, closed her notebook and regarded the scene with serene satisfaction, confident that the mystery had been unraveled with patience, insight, and the careful attention to human nature that had long distinguished her among the residents of Little Harrow. The first frost of the new year had softened, leaving Little Harrow glistening under a bright winter sun. Elmwood Manor, once the epicenter of whispered suspicions and careful observation, had returned to its routine appearance: polished floors, neatly arranged furniture, and the faint aroma of pine from the hearth. Yet beneath the surface, the village remained subtly altered, as if the revelation of hidden truths had left an invisible mark. Miss Marple strolled through the garden, now partially thawed, her keen eyes noting the arrangement of paths and the gentle curve of the flower beds beneath the melting snow. Even in apparent tranquility, she sensed the quiet ripple of events that had passed, the subtle changes in human behavior that lingered long after the immediate drama had subsided. Inside, Lady Ashcombe had departed to return to her estate, though her departure carried a tempered air of unease. Mr. Linton resumed his professional duties, yet his posture suggested the self-consciousness of one who had narrowly avoided suspicion. And Mrs. Penelope Faraday, though publicly composed, moved through the manor with careful precision, conscious of the balance between intention and consequence that her actions had revealed. Miss Marple paused near the drawing-room window, where the snow had receded to reveal small patches of green grass and scattered leaves. She recalled the series of subtle manipulations that had led to the tragic fall at the fountain, the careful positioning of the stool, the placement of the vase, the intercepted letters, and she reflected on the complexity of human nature that such events had revealed. Often, she thought, the most significant actions were the quietest, executed with the intention to control or protect, yet capable of producing unforeseen outcomes. The villagers began to resume their routines as well, though gossip, naturally, persisted. Conversations in the local shop, the post office, and even in the church carried hints of the recent revelations, though all were carefully couched in polite speculation. Miss Marple observed from a distance, noting the subtle shifts in tone, the fleeting expressions of anxiety and relief, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the surface tranquility of Little Harrow had been punctuated by profound insight into human motives. The children, unburdened by social conventions, still remarked on the fountain incident, asking questions with the innocent curiosity that adults could no longer display without caution. Miss Marple, seeing their observations, smiled inwardly. The fresh perspectives of the young often revealed truths overlooked by those preoccupied with propriety or fear of judgment. It was a reminder, she mused, that clarity often comes from unexpected sources. Within Elmwood Manor, Miss Marple conducted her quiet reflections, reviewing the events in her mind as she sipped tea by the fire. Each detail, the misaligned vase, the indentation in the snow, the smudged letter, the reactions of Lady Ashcombe and Mr. Linton, and the careful orchestration by Mrs. Faraday, was examined and catalogued. To the casual observer, the day's events might seem resolved simply by the identification of responsibility, yet Miss Marple knew the enduring lesson lay in the nuanced understanding of human behavior. The manor staff, returning to their normal duties, exhibited a combination of relief and residual apprehension. Their movements were efficient yet cautious, reflecting the subtle awareness that life in Little Harrow had shifted, that the ordinary routines of daily life now carried the memory of revelation. Miss Marple acknowledged the change with her characteristic quiet understanding, recognizing that human nature, once glimpsed in its complexity, leaves permanent imprints, however gently they may be, masked by social decorum. As the afternoon sun waned, Miss Marple visited the village church, where Reverend Smythe was quietly arranging the pews for evening prayers. The vicar, ever respectful of her insight, remarked on the extraordinary calm now enveloping the parish. "It seems, Miss Marple," he said, "that the village has returned to normal. And yet—" He paused, allowing the implication to hang in the air. Miss Marple nodded gently. "And yet, Reverend, human nature has been revealed, and once seen, it cannot be entirely forgotten. Even if routine returns, awareness lingers, shaping thought, conversation, and subtle judgments. The outward calm is a veil over the truths that have been uncovered." In the quiet of the evening, she walked the familiar streets of Little Harrow, noting the shops reopening, children playing, and neighbors exchanging greetings. The rhythm of life had resumed, yet she sensed the delicate tension between what had occurred and what remained hidden. Villagers, though no longer actively observing one another, carried in their minds a subtle recalibration of trust, expectation, and understanding. Miss Marple reflected on Mrs. Faraday's actions, considering the balance between intention and consequence. Though her orchestration of events had been unintentional in its ultimate effect, it had highlighted the capacity for human foresight, planning, and subtle influence. Even kindness, when combined with miscalculation or concealed anxiety, could yield outcomes far beyond expectation. Returning to Elmwood Manor as night fell, Miss Marple paused by the drawing-room, gazing at the faint shadows cast by the fireplace. The village was quiet, yet alive with stories, memories, and reflections of the recent events. She contemplated the way each individual had revealed their character through gestures, choices, and subtle interactions, noting the enduring lesson that understanding people requires patience, attention, and the willingness to perceive what others overlook. Before retiring, she made a small note in her diary, recording observations not only of actions, but of intentions, micro-expressions, and the ways subtle pressures influenced behavior. The record was for her eyes alone, a careful cataloguing of the interplay of motive, concealment, and consequence that had defined the tragedy at Elmwood Manor. It was, she thought, the most enduring form of understanding, one that transcended gossip, speculation, and superficial judgment. Finally, as night deepened and the first stars appeared in the crisp winter sky, Miss Marple settled into her chair with a soft sigh. Elmwood Manor was restored to its outward tranquility, the village to its routine, yet she knew the deeper awareness of human nature would persist. In subtle gestures, whispered observations, and carefully concealed truths, the events surrounding Mr. Calderwood's death had illuminated both the fragility and the intricacy of human behavior. And, with that, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile, understanding that in observing, listening, and patiently connecting the fragments, she had not only unraveled a mystery, but had glimpsed the enduring patterns that shape human life, an understanding that would, as always, remain her own. The village of Little Harrow had resumed its quiet rhythm, yet an intangible tension lingered, subtle but pervasive, like the last chill of winter in early spring. Elmwood Manor, though outwardly restored to routine, carried the memory of recent events, the tragedy, the subtle manipulations, and the revelations of human behavior that Miss Marple had quietly discerned. To the villagers, life appeared to continue as usual, yet beneath the surface, the awareness of what had transpired had left traces that could not easily be erased. Miss Marple walked through the manor gardens once again, the frost having given way to patches of early green grass. Her observations of the footprints in the snow and the now-thawed paths revealed patterns she had long noted but had previously only mentally catalogued. Even in their disappearance, they retained significance, for the impressions of deliberate movement were now etched into memory, rather than snow. The quiet manipulation of space, timing, and attention that had caused the incident at the fountain remained a vivid lesson in human behavior. Inside the manor, the staff had regained their composure, yet subtle changes were noticeable. Sarah Hensley moved with more confidence, aware that her careful attention to detail and her honest observations had contributed meaningfully to understanding what had happened. The housekeeper, usually reserved, carried a restrained tension, a silent acknowledgement that her influence had indirectly contributed to the events, though she had acted with no ill intent. Miss Marple observed all this with her customary patience, understanding that human actions, no matter how minor, ripple beyond immediate consequences. Lady Ashcombe, having returned briefly to the village to settle her affairs, remained a presence in Miss Marple's thoughts. Her meticulous control and outward composure had masked fleeting signs of uncertainty and unease. Observing Lady Ashcombe, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance between social expectation and inner reality, noting how individuals navigate the interplay of pride, duty, and fear when confronted with sudden crisis. Even those seemingly most composed may reveal themselves in minute gestures or hesitations if one knows how to watch. Mr. Thomas Linton had also resumed his professional activities, yet his demeanor was subtly altered. The close brush with suspicion, though eventually clarified, had sharpened his awareness of the delicate nature of perception. Miss Marple noted that fear of judgment, even when unfounded, can leave lasting impressions on conduct, influencing choices in ways unnoticed by the casual observer. Mrs. Penelope Faraday, having acknowledged her unintended role in the accident at the fountain, moved through the manor with a measured calm. Her actions had not been malicious, but the subtle orchestration of events had caused consequences she had neither foreseen nor desired. Miss Marple, ever gentle, recognized the complexity of human intention. Well-meaning influence can, through a combination of circumstance and misjudgment, yield outcomes far removed from initial intent. In the quiet of the drawing-room one late afternoon, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reflecting on the broader implications of the case. The events surrounding Mr. Calderwood's death had illuminated several key truths. First, that human behavior is often governed by motives hidden beneath layers of social decorum. Second, that even minor, seemingly inconsequential actions can produce profound consequences. And third, that patience, observation, and a nuanced understanding of psychology are more effective in revealing truth than force or accusation. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the gardens shimmered under soft sunlight. The subtle shifts in snow and vegetation mirrored the patterns she had long observed in human interaction. Small gestures, minor deviations, and fleeting expressions often carry greater significance than loud statements or obvious behaviors. To the untrained eye, these are mere background details. To a careful observer, they are threads connecting action to intention. She considered the villagers, reflecting on how each had contributed to the resolution, whether consciously or not. The children, with their innocent observations, had provided crucial insights overlooked by adults. The staff had unwittingly revealed patterns of behavior and placement that clarified timing and movement. Even minor disagreements, interpersonal frictions, and unspoken resentments had functioned as markers, guiding her understanding of the complex social web surrounding Elmwood Manor. As evening approached, Miss Marple paused in the hallway, listening to the soft creaks of the manor settling, the faint sounds of the village beyond, and the quiet murmur of distant conversation. She considered how easily the ordinary, the everyday, conceals extraordinary complexity. Little Harrow, with its serene facades, had contained tensions, secrets, and subtle manipulations capable of producing tragedy. It was the intersection of intention, observation, and circumstance that had determined outcomes, and this delicate interplay had remained invisible to all except the most patient observer. Miss Marple reflected further on the role of chance and foresight. While Mrs. Faraday had acted deliberately to guide events, certain outcomes, the precise sequence of movements, the final fall at the fountain, had been unpredictable. Human intention and the unpredictability of circumstance combine in ways that create both tragedy and revelation. Understanding this dynamic, Miss Marple knew, was essential to interpreting behavior and anticipating consequences. She thought also of the villagers' ongoing adjustment to the revelations. While life outwardly returned to normal, subtle changes in interactions persisted. Glances held a fraction longer, conversations carried unspoken awareness, and politeness was tinged with the cautious weight of knowledge. Trust, though restored, had been recalibrated. Suspicion, though diminished, remained faintly perceptible. The incident had shifted the social fabric, and Miss Marple understood that even resolved mysteries leave enduring ripples in communal life. Finally, as night fell over Elmwood Manor, Miss Marple seated herself by the fire, a small notebook in hand. She recorded reflections not merely on the mechanics of the incident, but on human nature itself, the ways subtlety, observation, and understanding reveal intentions, the interplay between well-meaning actions and unforeseen consequences, and the enduring truth that human behavior is rarely straightforward. In documenting these lessons, she reaffirmed her belief that the quiet art of observation, patience, and reflection remains the most effective means of understanding both tragedy and morality. And so, Little Harrow returned to its peaceful rhythm, the village streets quiet under the starlight, the manor restored to its outward calm. Yet beneath the surface, human nature had been revealed and understood, and Miss Marple, with her serene composure, carried within her a precise map of intentions, actions, and consequences, a map that would guide her future inquiries and illuminate truths hidden in the ordinary interactions of daily life. The shadows of Elmwood Manor, long and subtle, were now illuminated by understanding, and in the quiet reflection of the evening, Miss Marple allowed herself a soft, knowing smile. Life would continue, as it always does, yet the lessons of human nature, complex, delicate, and endlessly fascinating, would remain, quietly guiding those who chose to observe, listen, and comprehend. The following week, Little Harrow awoke to a rare calm, the winter thaw leaving the streets bright with sun and the gardens glistening with dew. Elmwood Manor, once the scene of whispered suspicions and quiet manipulations, now resumed its role as a center of village life, though the memory of recent events lingered like a faint fragrance in the air. To casual observers, life had returned to normal. For those who had been closely involved, nothing was ever quite the same. Miss Marple, walking through the village lane, noted the subtle changes in demeanor among the residents. Conversations were careful yet warm, laughter tinged with a hint of retrospection. The children played freely in the garden of the vicarage, occasionally pointing toward the fountain and speculating on the events of the past weeks with innocent curiosity. Even the adults, who carried a more nuanced understanding, had adapted to the shift in awareness, their daily routines continuing under the weight of newfound knowledge. Elmwood Manor itself had settled into a rhythm of quiet domesticity. Mrs. Penelope Faraday, having reconciled with the consequences of her actions, moved with deliberate composure. She had accepted Miss Marple's guidance and understood that her intentions, though initially protective, had produced unforeseen outcomes. The subtle orchestration of events she had enacted was no longer a source of tension, but rather a lesson in careful awareness. Lady Winifred Ashcombe returned to her estate, her departure marked by a courteous visit to Miss Marple. "You have a remarkable talent," she said softly, her composure impeccable, yet her eyes betraying lingering unease. "I can scarcely imagine how you discern the truth with such patience and subtlety." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Observing human nature is like reading a book," she replied. "Each gesture, glance, and hesitation is a sentence, each action a paragraph. When one reads carefully, even the most complex narrative becomes clear." Mr. Thomas Linton also visited Elmwood Manor one afternoon, bringing with him the final documents concerning Calderwood's estate. His expression was a mixture of relief and reflection. "I confess, Miss Marple," he admitted, "I feared suspicion might fall upon me, yet your careful observation and patience revealed not only the truth, but the delicate nuances that most would overlook." Miss Marple nodded. "And that, Mr. Linton, is the nature of understanding. It is rarely immediate, often subtle and dependent upon the quiet accumulation of detail." The village, though outwardly calm, had been irrevocably altered in subtle ways. Gossip persisted, as it always does, yet tempered by the awareness that actions, however minor, carry consequences beyond the immediate perception of those involved. Small gestures, previously unnoticed, now held potential significance. Polite exchanges, casual glances, and fleeting expressions were read with greater attention, though without malice. Miss Marple reflected on the key elements that had unraveled the mystery. First, there had been the manipulation of physical space, the carefully placed stool, the misaligned vase, and the slight displacements in the manner that guided movement. Second, the subtle behavioral cues, the fleeting expressions, micro-gestures, and minor hesitations revealed intent without need for overt accusation. Finally, the psychological orchestration by Mrs. Faraday had demonstrated the delicate interplay of intention, foresight, and consequence. All had converged to create the incident at the fountain, a tragedy framed within the subtleties of human nature. In her quiet moments by the window of Elmwood Manor, Miss Marple considered the enduring lessons of the case. Human beings, she reflected, are a blend of conscious action and unconscious influence, of intention and circumstance. Even well-meaning efforts, if guided by incomplete understanding or miscalculation, can lead to outcomes neither desired nor anticipated. It is through careful observation and patient consideration that these patterns are revealed. The villagers had gradually adjusted, their awareness of human complexity enriching their interactions. Lady Ashcombe, returning briefly to the manor for a social call, displayed a subtle shift in understanding, less rigid in her judgments, more attentive to nuance. Mr. Linton, similarly, demonstrated a cautious kindness tempered by a deeper awareness of social influence and human fallibility. Mrs. Faraday, once anxious and secretive, moved forward with a reflective composure, aware of her own power to affect outcomes in ways both small and significant. Miss Marple, ever composed, continued her quiet reflections, noting that while the immediate mystery had been resolved, the broader truths of human behavior persisted. Every village, every household, contained small actions and hidden intentions, each influencing the tapestry of daily life in ways rarely noticed. To observe, to listen, and to interpret these subtleties was to understand not merely events, but the enduring patterns of human interaction. As the sun set over Little Harrow, casting long shadows across the snow-melted gardens, Miss Marple allowed herself a final moment of contemplation. Elmwood Manor, restored to outward tranquility, reflected the balance between consequence and intention. The villagers, though unaware of every detail, had absorbed the lessons in their own way: the importance of observation, the subtlety of influence, and the enduring significance of careful thought and reflection. Finally, as night settled and the stars appeared above the village, Miss Marple closed her diary, recording the last reflections on the case. She wrote of intention and consequence, of human frailty and subtle strength, and of the quiet lessons embedded in the everyday interactions that shape outcomes in ways both visible and invisible. In the stillness of Elmwood Manor, she paused, gazing at the faint shadows cast by the trees outside and the gentle flicker of firelight. The events surrounding Mr. Calderwood's death had revealed much about human nature, yet the greater understanding lay not merely in resolving the incident, but in recognizing the patterns that would recur in every village, every household, and every life. And so, Little Harrow returned to its serene rhythm, though enriched by the enduring awareness of human complexity. The village streets were bright with the lingering frost, the gardens held the promise of spring, and the manor stood as a quiet testament to patience, perception, and the subtle genius of observation. Miss Marple, ever composed, understood that the world was far more intricate than appearances suggested, and that the greatest mysteries were often hidden not in dramatic actions, but in the quiet interplay of intention, behavior, and consequence. With a soft sigh and a gentle smile, she set aside her pen, content in the knowledge that truth, once discerned with care and insight, could illuminate even the most subtle shadows of human life. Elmwood Manor, Little Harrow, and its inhabitants would continue their lives, carrying with them a deeper understanding of each other, guided quietly by the lessons revealed through the patient observation of one remarkable woman.